Hey, it's Mike here, and today my response to the Game Changers documentary being debunked by a real doctor. This Swedish dude, his video has about 100,000 views, and this video checks all of my boxes. It actually has some science in it, unlike, Joe Rogan just rambling off some myths and bro science. But in denouncing the movie, this guy makes a ton of crazy claims, amazing claims, like how antioxidants in plants aren't actually good for you. That's just a myth. Or how saturated fat doesn't impair artery function, or how, maybe that cloudy blood is actually better than clear blood. Well, he at least speculates that. So we're gonna talk about those gladiators, we're gonna talk about carbs and heme iron, and a little bit about protein, and so many other things. And quickly, I wanna mention that this is one of my rare partnership videos. This is a partnership with Wuxley, which is an awesome company that makes super warm jackets that are rated to really cold temperatures. I've done a whole video about them in the past. And they're really the vegan antidote to Canada Goose, which uses fur and goose down. And we'll talk more about them in a bit. There's some huge news with Wuxley, and I can give you my sort of update on having a coat for about a year. But back to the topic at hand, his Game Changers response is super long, and so I'm just gonna stick to the main points and actually speed him up by about 25%. I think he's still understandable then. But this is funny because a couple videos ago, I just did a video on Eric Berg, and now I'm doing a video on Dr. Ekberg, who, get this, also has a whiteboard. It's like Eric Berg is a Pokemon that evolved into this guy. He's like the next level of low carb bosses. Anyway, and yes, this guy does make videos on low carb foods and keto weight loss. And I will say he's arguing from the pro meat angle and I'm arguing from the vegan angle, but it's really about who's presenting the better information, who has the better sources that are used appropriately, and you can judge that for yourself. Let's see what he has to say, starting really with where the movie starts on the gladiators and how they were at least mostly vegetarian.
To think that the original professional fighters ate mainly plants went against everything I'd been taught about nutrition.
The first argument in the movie is that plant food is superior because the original fighters, gladiators, were vegetarian. And I'm not going to argue whether they were or not.
And yeah, he shouldn't argue with what they ate because it's very clear that these gladiators, also known as the barley eaters, based off bone data, were very highly plant-based. Anyway.
They were valued like animals for slaughter. The purpose was only to make the gladiator last long enough and perform well enough to last a couple of years as a fighter before he was sacrificed for the purpose of entertainment. Gladiators, most were despised as slaves, schooled under harsh conditions, socially marginalized, and segregated even in death.
So he takes the angle that these people were treated like trash, they were not fed the best diets, and were probably unhealthy. But to do that, he would have to explain away their high bone mineral density.
And sure enough, I'm sure that the gladiators had very good bone quality because human bone gets stronger up to about age 20. That's when a human is fully grown. And these gladiators, they really didn't live much longer. They would have died early in their careers at 18 to 25 years of age. Yes, they're not going to have osteoporosis. They're not going to have signs of degeneration. They're going to be young, healthy people no matter what you feed them.
To me, this isn't a strong case as to why they would become unhealthy in the future if they lived longer. I mean, clearly these people were capable of athletic feats, and we'll see in a second why they probably would have had fine bone density going into older age.
And one of the physicians that provided that top medical care was a Greek physician called Galen. And he was to become arguably the most accomplished of all medical researchers of antiquity.
He reads directly from Wikipedia about this gladiator Dr. Galen and how amazing he was and how he criticized the gladiators' diets.
He saw and would later criticize the training, diet, and long-term health prospects of the gladiators.
Like a doctor from 200 AD must be right. This is like an appeal to ancient authority fallacy. I don't even know. And maybe his criticisms were that they needed more vegetables and fruit. But from Galen, we also know that these gladiators were eating a bean pudding as well as barley. And it appears that these were mostly broad beans that they're eating. So right away, we can actually get a nutrition read from Chronometer. Let's assume that they were eating about 1/3 of their calories from these beans and 2/3 from barley. And they're actually going to be hitting an omega ratio better than most people today at 2-to-1. For those that are concerned, they slam past their protein needs. And their calcium levels are comparable to countries today that don't have bone mineral density issues. They also drank what some referred to as Gladiator Gatorade, which was essentially an ash tonic that had some added calcium. So they were way more than covered in the calcium department. And to put their diet in perspective, from one of the researchers who co-authored the paper on bones that spurred this whole gladiator thing in the first place, told told Live Science that even though they were slaves, quote, the gladiators' diet probably wasn't all that different from the mostly vegetarian fare eaten by the Roman populace. And another point I got a major kick out of on the gladiators, which he didn't mention, but is mentioned in a lot of Game Changers debunks, is that, yeah, this high carb, high barley diet of the gladiators actually made them fat. And the reason they fed them so many carbs is because it was more entertaining to watch these fat people get sliced up. Now that's ridiculous because it's totally based on the bias of people against carbs. These people were not overweight. People around the world who eat a ton of carbs are not overweight on average, like in Asia, traditionally at least. And we have mosaics of gladiators at the time, so we can just look right at this one and, oh crap, you're right, they're obese. Kidding, these people are normal. Everyone just has their carb-phobic glasses on. And the point here is that this diet, this highly plant-based diet, was capable of producing athletes. It was capable of producing the Roman populace, and James Wilkes' main point is right. And I would also add that people are putting so much weight on this gladiator point, like the whole movie depends on it, in other debunks especially. But the reality is this is just what James used as an example of what opened his mind up to that people could be athletes without eating high meat diets. Then the documentary goes on. Okay, I want to take a quick break to talk about this Wuxley news because it's super fascinating to me. And the news is Wuxley's new super beastly jacket called the Sabertooth. It's designed to be warmer than any Canada Goose jacket. From my research, the 200 gram Primaloft Gold insulation is roughly equivalent to Canada Goose's warmest jacket at a Clo or clothing insulation value of 0.92. Well, Wuxley has actually doubled that Primaloft insulation in this jacket and added a reflective layer, so there's no contest, especially because down loses warmth when wet and Primaloft essentially doesn't. The temperature rating says it all, negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit. It will be available next week. Let's just say I don't think Canada Goose's slogan of the warmest jacket on the planet is true anymore. That slogan is dead. And since I last mentioned Wuxley, they've also launched the Queen Parka for women, which they cannot keep on the shelf. It's also super warm with great coverage. They are not using down. They're 100% vegan, so you don't need to be using these animal products to keep yourself warm. Also, I've had my jacket for almost a year, and we had a super brutal winter last year in Iowa. We had some negative 30 temperatures. Everything was covered in ice, and the jacket was awesome. It kept me super warm. So congratulations to those over at Wuxley for pulling it off, and I will link all of their jackets below. And yes, they are not cheapo jackets. These are ethically made in terms of humans and animals. People are paid a fair wage to make these, and they are still cheaper than Canada Goose jackets. Okay, back to Dr. Ekberg. The next point is a little bit of a nitpicking on my part, but when talking about Scott Jurek.
Next, James Wilkes meets up with an ultra-marathon runner. Has been very successful and has broken all sorts of records, and he ran the Appalachian Trail faster than anyone had done before. And this person is a vegetarian.
No, he outright gets this point wrong. Scott Jurek is not a vegetarian. He's a longtime vegan. He has set most of his ultra-marathoning records as a vegan. I just had to clear that up. The next section, they start talking about using protein versus carbs for energy, and they use this animated chart to talk about how, carbs are a better source of energy than protein.
And when we sacrifice those carbohydrate calories for protein calories in our diet, what ends up happening is you will develop really chronic carbohydrate or glycogen depletion. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to chronic fatigue and loss of stamina.
Of course, from the low carb perspective, Ekberg doesn't like this, and he makes a claim which I found to be quite amazing.
Even if you eat zero fat, which you wouldn't last very long, but if you eat extremely low fat diet, your body, your cells, still run at about 50% carbohydrate and 50% fat.
Yeah, he said even if you're eating 100% of your calories from carbs, your body is going to turn half of those into fat just because fat is so awesome. First of all, no citation for this anywhere. Just because you write it on a whiteboard doesn't mean it's true. And well, yeah, maybe they were able to get this reading of 50-50 on a specific group of people at a specific time, but I definitely call BS on this because just evolutionarily, thermodynamically, this is really inefficient. We know from this study that de novo lipogenesis, turning sugar into fat, throws away about 30% of energy, and that would just be evolutionarily a horrible way to function. And throughout his video, Ekberg makes a lot of sort of criticisms and comments about fat and ignoring fat, but the reality is this doesn't really have anything to do with a plant-based diet being good or not. You can eat a high-fat, plant-based diet. Just thought I'd mention that. Moving on. And when you're low-carb, you're just anti-carb as a rule. Everything is the fault of carbs.
What robs you of stamina is when you are not fat adapted and when you eat enough carbs to become insulin resistant. it's the insulin resistance that creates the chronic fatigue, not the other way around.
It's funny how vegans who eat significantly more carbs have 78% lower total risk of diabetes from this Adventist study. Next, if you watch the movie, you remember there was a section where they talked about how eating all this saturated fat impairs artery function. Well, here's his response.
So I went to look at some of the research, and I didn't have time to look at a bunch of it, but I did just sort of pick one at random to see what it said. It's listed in the movie. And what they actually said, though, is that saturated fatty acids do not impair endothelial function and arterial stiffness.
So he says this study that he happened to pick at random was cited in the movie. I would love to spend an hour and a half searching for this exact citation in the movie. I didn't find it with a quick skim, but I'm going to take his word for it. If it wasn't there, it was probably accidentally cited, but here is what he has to say about it.
And in the conclusion, it says, the replacement of saturated fatty acids with multi-unsaturated fatty acids or carbohydrates in healthy subjects does not affect the vascular function.
Quick correction, it's not multi-unsaturated fatty acids, it's mono-unsaturated fatty acids. I'll let that one slide though. So I have a few problems with this study and the conclusions he's basing off of it. First, the title, saturated fatty acids don't impair artery function, is just an ultimate statement, which is very rare for researchers to make, especially based off a certain group of people. Speaking of the group of people, he read in the conclusion that they were healthy subjects, but earlier in the design of the study, it says that they are insulin resistant, which by definition is not considered a healthy subject. Next, the reason saturated fat probably didn't look worse was because they compared it to a group of these insulin resistant people who were fed some refined carbs instead, or they were fed sunflower oil, which is high omega-6, and similar oils have been shown to cause artery impairment as well. And while he admits that there are probably some studies that find saturated fat bad for artery function, he's really painting this as a 50-50 situation. You know, half of them might find it's good, half of them might find it's bad.
I'm sure that there were some positive findings in some of the other research. I'm not disputing that. But for every piece of research that says one thing, there is an equally prestigious piece of research that says the opposite. That when you look enough into research, it's almost like a perfect 50-50 split.
But the reality is it's more like 95-5. And he found the one study, just conveniently, accidentally, that happened to show that saturated fat was okay. What happens when you take a group of people who are generally insulin resistant, people with type 2 diabetes, and you don't feed them refined carbs instead of saturated fat to compare? Well, this study, which alternated people's diets randomly to high saturated fat versus low saturated fat, found that, quote, consumption of a saturated fatty acid rich meal is harmful for the endothelium, which is the lining of the arteries and the measurement of artery function that people tend to do. In other words, it impaired artery function. Here's another trial that randomly switched people between diets including high saturated fat and high carb diet, and saturated fat impaired arteries twice as bad as all other diets. Quote, high saturated fatty acids cause deterioration of flow-mediated dilation, which is artery function, compared with the high polyunsaturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, or high carb diet. And inflammatory responses may also be increased on this diet. Oh, I could do this all day. From this other trial that looked at older adults, in conclusion, endothelial fibrinolytic dysfunction may underlie the increased atherothrombotic disease risk with a diet high in saturated fat. Here's another one on healthy people. Saturated fat was associated with impaired artery function. To flip around something he said in the beginning about the Game Changers documentary, Mr. Ekberg.
And they cherry pick certain pieces of information and they present it in a way that it looks like the truth.
Now we get to the famous clear versus cloudy blood scene where they take the blood of people after they had either a higher animal meal or a plant-based meal. They spin it in a centrifuge, and then the high animal one has a cloudier blood than the plant-based one.
Evidence, there is no proof, there's no suggestion. What if cloudy is better? There's lots of athletes who eat meat and do extremely well with cloudy blood. Maybe that's better. Okay, the research they gave certainly didn't support the fact that it had any impact.
Yes, he just said maybe cloudy is better. And now I've played my fair share of sports throughout my life. I've played varsity soccer and I've done varsity track. And one rule that you always have is not eating before you do any athletic performance, and actually being really careful to strategize when to eat meals so that you don't feel crappy when you're playing. And this is probably because of the super high saturated fat that people usually eat, but I've literally eaten whole starch-based, plant-based meals and shortly after run 10 miles. It's doable. And Scott Jurek actually eats things like pita while he is running. And my personal anecdotes and experience are fun and all, but we do actually have science behind this, what happens to your blood after you eat these meals. This is called postprandial hyperlipidemia or lipemia, which I like to just call sludge blood. Looking to the research, these high animal fat meals slam your blood with more fat, which impairs blood flow and also lowers oxygen, neither of which are good for athletic performance. It also increases platelet aggregation, your blood cells sticking together, because the fat actually messes with the natural negative charge that keeps your blood cells apart, which can't be good for things like oxygen delivery. This lipemia is also the cause of angina in people with heart disease. In this study, it's referred to as lactescence of the blood. You can see that angina episodes coincided with when lactescence of blood peaked. X marks the fat. Then talk about the anatomy points. You know, are humans best suited to eat plants or not? Of course, he says that we are not best suited to eat just plants. And I could spend a ton of time responding to this, but I'd like to just cover 2 points in the interest of time.
A little later in the movie, they ask the question, well, what are humans actually supposed to eat? Have a different digestive tract than a lion, but we are closer to a lion, much closer to a lion than we are to a cow.
After comparing us just to ruminants, which are one type of herbivore that we obviously are not, he makes this claim.
People that eat primarily plants, there's some people that eat primarily fish, some eat primarily fruit, and they all do relatively well because we are omnivores.
Actually, Arctic tribes who survive very highly on animal products do not do well. They do some of the worst. They have the highest rate of atherosclerosis in their mummies, for what it's worth. They also have about a 10-year lower life expectancy than the surrounding populations, and before they were westernized had atherosclerosis and osteoporosis. It's not a good diet, sadly, for them. But this next statement is my favorite thing in the whole video, I think I have to say.
If we look at the teeth, human teeth are sharp in the front and flat in the back, so that we can do both.
Yes, he actually said that humans have sharp teeth in the front and shows this picture of this girl. I did not Photoshop that on there. That's the one he uses. I feel like she could just bite me in half. Compare that to the lion he just showed a bit ago, showing that we have the same type of front teeth. No, this is what they would have to look like. Level 10 meat goggles is what he's wearing. And let's get on to the next subject, which is antioxidants, where he also makes some of his most ridiculous claims.
So if we have bought into the idea of antioxidants, then that sounds like a compelling argument. Like, wow, 64 times more antioxidants. So all of this is part of a big myth. The first thing is that what antioxidants are and who they're good for. There's nothing magical about antioxidants in plants.
Can we just back up here? He's saying that the benefits of antioxidants in plants are just a big myth. It's totally a big myth. He's going against the consensus of basically, there's no one that I know that thinks this. I don't know where this came from. But antioxidants in plants are amazing. We have such a massive body of literature on this. For example, carotenoids are amazing when they build up in your skin. They can prevent photoaging in your eyes. They prevent UV damage. You know, we have polyphenols from this study, quote, epidemiological studies and associated meta-analysis strongly suggest that long-term consumption of diets rich in plant polyphenols offer protection against development of cancers, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, osteoporosis, and neurodegenerative diseases. In pilots, their antioxidant consumption is directly associated with how much DNA damage they just have in their body. But instead, somehow he thinks it's good enough to just fully rely on glutathione, which is an antioxidant that we make in our own body.
Inside our own cells, we make something called glutathione. And that is the primary and the only antioxidants that really matter in humans. And guess what? It doesn't come from a plant. It is made up from 3 amino acids. They're called glycine, glutamine, and cysteine. And amino acids, of course, are protein.
Forget antioxidants, you just need to eat protein. And yeah, well, glutathione is super duper important. It's kind of funny. You can make it from plant protein, and ironically, vegans have higher levels of free serum albumin of blood protein than people who eat meat from this study. So they would be able to make more glutathione theoretically. And from this paper, they ironically cite eating more vitamin C as a strategy to increase glutathione, also mentioning that eating more fruits and vegetables decreases oxidative stress, which is what we're talking about. Duh. And they then cite 5 intervention studies behind that, which are one of the most powerful types of research we have. There's a few other points he hits, but this video is getting long. So to mention one, he talks about how meat, of course, has superior protein. I recently did an in-depth response in my Eric Berg video on this. And firstly, again, those vegans have higher levels of free blood protein. Secondly, from this study, animal versus plant protein showed no difference in terms of muscle mass. So, but then he makes a hilarious claim about heme iron that, oh, the damage is, it could just be the sugar. It could be the refined grains.
They don't know what else that person ate. Okay? It could have been all the sugar or all the trans fats or all the bread that they had with it.
No, the damage of heme iron is not just an association with carb consumption. I mean, we have the animal models showing that you can actually induce a type of colorectal lesion from giving them heme iron. And it's horrible that we do things like that to animals, but this dude is just a master of taking what the majority of the research says and then somehow blaming carbs. I know if you looked at this study's chart on heme iron and colorectal cancer studies, he would definitely just be like, oh, I chose this study at random. The one that shows that there was a lower association, unlike pretty much all the rest. It then makes a case for why we should be eating heme iron to get iron. We should be eating animal blood, basically, and saying that it's superior. But the reality is, from this Swiss vegan study, this doesn't appear to be much of a concern because their iron deficiency rates were actually no different from the omnivores. In fact, they were just slightly lower, believe it or not. In conclusion, he only cited multiple Wikipedia pages, his own whiteboard, and one study on saturated fat and artery function. And that one study does appear to have some methodological flaws, as well as just concludes something that's against what pretty much every single study on artery function and saturated fat does, that it impairs it. His claims about the gladiators were not very compelling. I mean, it doesn't look like they were eating anything that different than the average population there, and they could easily be athletes off their mostly plant-based diet. And just his crazy claims about antioxidants are pretty mind-blowing, and I really hope people don't take them to heart. Also, just when he said that humans have sharp front teeth, I think that takes the cake. But of course, he has like a 90% like ratio, because when people hear good news about their bad habits, that they can ignore the Game Changers documentary and keep believing that animal protein is so great and that they need it and that they need to pay people to kill animals, then people are gonna like what they hear. But the reality is that Game Changers is by and large a super valid documentary. They use more research than pretty much any other documentary that most people are gonna be watching. It shows that fully vegan athletes can be super strong and perform at super high levels. Finally, I'll have a link to Wuxley's website and my last Wuxley video in the description below, so you can check them out if you want to. That's it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe. Let me know what you thought about this guy's claims, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.